everyone. Thanks for coming here fairly early. It's kind of a nice, cozy group. I feel like I should just be sitting down in front and talking to you. Maybe actually I will at some point. So I'm going to be talking to you about snakes and their relationship with primates. And there are going to be lots of pictures of snakes, especially at the beginning. So if you're kind of phobic, be ready to cover your eyes as you see some of these pictures, because they're pretty graphic. All right. It's important that you know that snakes eat primates. And if you look at the slide up there, the one on the right, there are two little heads there and down here. Those are two juvenile macaque monkeys that have been eaten by this snake. You say this snake here, here's his mouth, and here's what remains of a rather large primate that this snake has eaten. So snakes and primates, well, for as long as primates have existed, there have been snakes around. Obviously, snakes are reptiles, and the reptile taxa evolved much earlier than primate taxa did. So if you look up here, you can see that snakes have been around for 150 million years or something like that. And primates only came onto the scene maybe 50 million years ago or something like that. So the whole time that primates have been around, there have been snakes around. And that means that snakes have posed this heavy-duty selection pressure against primates since the very earliest of their evolutionary history. I just want to point out that I'm a primatologist. I study non-human primates, and so I study this interaction between snakes and primates from the primate point of view, kind of the primate perspective. But it's not just us, some of us primatologists who are making arguments about the importance of snakes to primates, but this man, his name is Harry Green. He's emeritus professor from Cornell University, and he knows more about snakes than I think anybody in the world knows, and I'm really quite serious about that. Really tremendously well-respected worldwide for his knowledge of snakes. And he, too, believes from the snake's perspective that primates and snakes have had this, as he calls it, 80 million years of a deadly dialogue with one another. Now, when you think of snakes, you might think of some small snakes, you might think of kind of large snakes, but did you know that there was a snake that lived between about 60 and 58 million years ago that was called Titanoboa, 42 feet long. That's about the length of a school bus. So just let that sink in for a minute. So these guys were roaming around the Earth for 20 million years or something like that, 12 million years. And they were probably too big to care very much about the tiny little primates that came about at the very sort of end of their reign. But just imagine what other gnarly snakes there must have been if there was such a thing as Titanoboa. So it's not just non-human primates, of course, that need to be worried about snakes. This is the Asiatic reticulated python, and it lives in all these parts of the world that you see in green here. And this was a skin from the Asiatic reticulated python. And this is now that they live in these parts of the world. Here you see a picture. This was taken in I don't know, probably 60 years ago, but these are a couple of native Filipinos who had captured a snake, reticulated python, and you can just see how big it was. An anthropologist did a study of, or interviewed a lot of people back in the not 1900s, it sounds like a long time ago, but yes, and found that many of them reported having been, had an interaction with one of these snakes, knew people who were killed by them, etc. And like I said, they're still around. They also will enter the ocean as well as being on land. So if you're thinking of visiting any parts of this world, try not to think about the fact that these snakes exist there. This is a Philippine cobra, and it has extremely deadly toxin. And what's scary about this particular kind of snake is that it spits its venom. It's a spitting cobra. You might have heard about them. They can spit their venom up to 10 feet away, and they aim for the victim's face. So it enters mucous membranes and does its killing that way. So these guys have evolved the ability to spit their venom. They don't have to be even right next to their victim to immobilize it. And Harry Green, the snake guy I showed you a picture of before, thinks that probably the evolution of their ability to do that stemmed from the fact that primates had learned so well how to avoid them and also to throw things at them, because not only humans throw things, but great apes will throw things, and some even monkeys will throw things at threats. That they evolve an ability to eject their venom over distance so that they would be safer at the same time. This is a quote that I wanted to put up here because it's pretty powerful, by Alan Harvey, who's president of the International Society of Toxinology. Because you probably haven't heard of toxinology, I hadn't. It's the scientific discipline dealing with microbial, plant, and animal venoms, poisons, and toxins. So he says, and I'll just read it, snakebite kills more people than other neglected tropical diseases combined, but is almost completely ignored and grossly underestimated. The World Health Organization and governments need to adjust their data and rank snake bites where it belongs as a very real public health and medical concern, which needs funding, training, and focus. So around the world, there are still people who are being bitten by snakes and even killed by them, and it's a serious issue in those parts of the world. So some of you remember Indiana Jones movies. If you never watched one, you should, especially the first one. They're great movies. And what he's famous for, one of the things, he's the main character, Indiana Jones, who's an archaeologist, but gets in these adventures all over the world. He's not afraid of anything except he really hates snakes. And it's kind of a funny joke throughout the movie about, it doesn't matter, we throw anything at him, he jumps off of trains and so forth, but snakes, no. And it makes sense, given what I've shown you so far, that we should be afraid of snakes. Not necessarily terrified of them, not necessarily phobic, but certainly a bit concerned about them, as he was. Okay, so if you have these dangerous predators in your environment, the best thing you can do is avoid them altogether, right? That's the safest thing, is just never to be in proximity to a dangerous snake. And snakes kill by, there's a whole group of snakes that are venomous and a whole group of snakes that kill by constricting. And so we need to be able to avoid not just one kind of snake, but many different kinds of snakes. If you don't avoid them, it may be too late, right? And it may be too late to avoid death if you don't avoid them in the first place. So what kinds of things have primates evolved to avoid snakes? Well, one thing that's true and has been demonstrated in many studies of many different kinds of primates is that primates tend to prefer to sleep off the ground. Even monkey and ape species that spend most of their time walking around on the ground will find trees or cliffs or other places where they can be off the ground when they sleep. And if possible, to be off the ground in places that are inaccessible or hidden. So a cluster of vines or these steep cliff faces. There's monkeys who almost cling to cliff faces all night long. And they only go to those cliff faces when they sleep. And then they leave. Now, it's not just snakes that they're avoiding there. In the case that I just brought up, it's probably more about leopards. But still, most snakes that are dangerous to us are on the ground, and so sleeping off the ground makes a lot of sense. Quite a few years ago now, one of my students and I did a study with red-bellied tamarins, and you see one of them up there. You'll see a closer picture in a little bit. Tamarins are New World monkeys. They're about this big, and they're arboreal. They spend most of their time off the ground, although they do come to the ground to get yummy food when they see it. And they have lots of predators, avian predators, mammalian predators, and snake predators. So we had a colony of these monkeys, and they were all born in captivity, and they lived indoors. But they, like as is true in the wild, when they go to bed at night, they go into a sleeping box that we always provide for species of monkeys because they like to be in enclosed areas when they sleep. So my student, Meg Potter, wanted to know exactly which criteria were important to these guys for going to bed, for their sleeping sites. So she made the 3 kinds of sleeping boxes you see on the left. So the one that had the most protection was the one with a hole in the middle. Then the medium size or medium amount of protection you see there on the left. And then the least protection was the box on the right. So on any given night, we would present the monkeys with a choice of 2 of the sleeping boxes, and then we rotated which choices they had over time. And what we found was that they almost always preferred the most, not almost always, but they preferred, strongly preferred the sleeping box that had the most concealment. And their second best choice was the one with the next best amount of concealment. And then they almost never would choose the box that was completely open. It was really, it was a really kind of powerful study because these monkeys didn't live outside and hadn't been in the wild, but still wanted to be in a place that was very protected. The next experiment involved that box, the type of box they most preferred, but we would take the top off of it. And as you can see, they almost always chose the box that had the top on it. Then in the third experiment, we put one box above the other, like you see on the right there, same box, and they always chose the one on top every single time. Okay? So again, even though these monkeys did not live outside and presumably had not seen any of their natural predators, they still had this very strong built-in desire to sleep in a safe place. Now, sleeping above the ground isn't 100% protection from snakes because there are arboreal snakes, there are tree snakes, some of which are venomous, some of which can kill with constriction. So being up there doesn't guarantee that you're safe from snakes. So another aspect of avoidance is to avoid locations where snakes have been encountered recently or regularly. So I'm sorry, I have to put that picture up there. It's so disturbing. This happened in San Diego, actually. And every once in a while you hear about that, of a pet snake getting loosed and somehow getting in the sewer system and ending up coming up through someone's toilet. I used to think that was an urban legend, an urban myth, but this really happened. And I think if it happened in your home, then every single time you went to the bathroom, I think you'd be really nervous about it and really wish you didn't have to use that toilet again. So yeah, avoiding locations where you've seen snakes before would be one good way of maintaining your safety, right? So my student, Sarah Hankerson, did a study for her thesis where she wondered if marmosets, and marmosets are closely related to tamarins, about the same size, also are mostly arboreal, also from South America, although from a different part of South America. She wondered if marmosets would remember where they'd seen a snake the day before. So marmosets, like tamarins, as I told you, both in the wild and in captivity, enter a sleeping site that's protected, and they do that whether they're outside or inside. They do that before it's dark or before the time when the lights normally go off. And they stay, once they're in, they pretty much stay put until the sun comes up the next day. From a point of view of a tamarin or marmoset, it's just too dangerous to be out and about when it's dark. Their eyes, like human eyes, are very diurnal, and we don't see well in the dark, and so stay safe. So what we wondered is, if the marmosets saw a snake model, a realistic snake model, which, believe me, they treat as if it's a real snake, a very realistic model. They scream at it and act just like they do with a real snake. So if they saw a snake model right before they went to bed, but had to go to bed with the snake still there because it got dark, what would happen the next morning? Would they forget about it? Would they act like they didn't even remember it had happened? Or would they act as if they remembered what happened? So here's the experimental setup. So this was enclosure that we had for a while at the safari park off exhibit. And there's actually two sides of it you can't see very well, but a group of monkeys lived on this side and another group on this side. So here's a schematic of that. This is where you enter. This is a solid wall in the middle. And these are their sleeping boxes. This group had two of them because they had more monkeys in the group, and this one had one. And these are the monkeys that we were studying at the time, Joffrey's marmosets. And these X's represent places where we put up the blinds behind which we would put the stimulus. Here's what that looked like. So here's a blind. There's two pieces of wood and then a piece of tarp. And the reason we set it up a blind like this is because we could tell if the monkey was looking at the snake. The only way you could see it is if you came over there, right to that place, and peered over the tarp. So we knew when a monkey was inspecting a snake or a location, that location. And then we would put a stimulus, and it was either this this is a freeze-dried rattlesnake. And like I said, we used this in many studies, and the monkeys always acted like this was real. In fact, when I ordered this and the box arrived, and I opened the box, it took me a good 30 seconds, I'm not kidding you, to reach in, to pull it out. My entire cortex was saying, it's dead, and it's freeze-dried. But there was everything else was saying, don't reach in and grab that thing. And we'll come back to this in a minute because it's important for the whole story. I mean, the fact that I had that reaction, and you probably would have too. Anyway, so very realistic. Then there was a control item like a bandana, and on some days we just put nothing there. So what would happen is that as the day, so these cages were outside obviously, and so as the day approached dusk, the monkeys were getting ready to go to bed, we would place either this, or again on some days there would be nothing there, behind the blind. The monkeys would come over, they'd be very upset about it, alarm calling and doing all the things they do when they see a snake. But it was getting dark, so eventually they had to go to one of their boxes and leave that behind. And you could tell they didn't like it because they wait until the last minute to go into their boxes. But what could you do? Okay, it's dark. So once it was completely dark, whoever was there, this was usually me, I would then very quietly go over, take the stimulus away for the night. The next morning, Sarah, my student, would arrive before the sun came up and sit near the monkeys and just wait until the monkeys got up. Now, Sarah didn't know what stimulus had been there the night before, so she's what we call blind to condition. If you've taken research methods classes in psychology, blind to condition. She didn't know what stimulus has been there before, and you can imagine how important that was. Because she didn't know, she couldn't unintentionally bias her data collection, just sort of hoping that she'd find what she was hoping to find. But here's what she found. So look over here. Okay, this is time to first check. So when the monkeys got up in the morning, how long did it take from the first one who left the sleeping box to come over and check behind the blind? When there was a snake there, very short amount of time. In fact, usually what they did is come out of the nest box, look around, and go right over to that blind and peer over it. When it was the cloth or no stimulus, it took them much longer to go over and check behind the blind. Furthermore, over the course of the next hour or so, they kept checking much more often than they did with the other two conditions. So again, this is the snake condition. The amount of time they spent checking was much greater, significantly greater than the other conditions. And then this variable, this measure, was an interesting one. The marmosets would, even though in the wild they're mostly all arboreal, they're mostly in trees, like I said, even in the wild and in captivity too, if they see a really juicy bug, they really like bugs, or maybe a piece of food that fallen to the ground, they'll go down and get it. So Sarah had predicted that if they had seen a snake the night before and they remembered it, and when they go over to check, it's not there anymore, then they should be thinking, okay, where might that snake be? So they should be reluctant to go to the ground, right, where that snake would be. And sure enough, it took them much longer to make their first trip to the ground when the snake had been there last night. So these little monkeys somehow have the ability to retain a memory of that a snake had been there and where it was, because they always went to the right blind too. Remember, we had 2 blinds and the snake had only been behind one of them, and they always went to that one to check. So from their point of view, this is a really good adaptation to have. If we know the snake has been around, and maybe even days and days before, we don't know, in the wild anyway, don't go there again. All right, so if you can't avoid a snake, the next best thing is to be able to detect the snake as rapidly as possible. So what you want to be able to do is have the ability to know that a snake is there, and then you can avoid getting in a confrontation with the snake. So how would one detect a snake? Well, we would use one of our sensory systems, right, to do that. Might they listen for a snake? Well, except in the case of rattlesnakes, and that's a powerful adaptation on their part, to warn things, you get near me and I'm going to mess with you. Other than that, snakes don't make much noise. I mean, they can move very quietly. And oftentimes, if they're ambush predators, as many of them are, they're not even moving. So using your ears is probably not the best way to detect a snake. How about the tactile sense, by touch? Obviously, if you get close enough to a snake to touch it, you're probably in trouble. So the tactile sense is not going to work very well. What about olfaction? Primates are known for their visual capabilities much more so than their olfactory capabilities, but they have pretty good olfactory systems. So maybe they smell snakes. We did a study, again, with the red-bellied tamarins that you see up there. Now, this wasn't with snake odors, but I want to show you what we found as a prelude to talking about snake odors. So in this study, what we were interested in is whether or not the fecal odors of mammalian predators would be recognized and avoided by the tamarins. So again, these were all captive-born monkeys, and this was they had lots of branches in their enclosures, and we would strap a dowel onto the branch, and that dowel either was odorless, it was just a dowel without any odor on it, or it had a particular chemical on it that had been used to extract the predator odor, and is a fecal odor. So we gathered fecal samples from their predators. Then there was a control of a non-predator fecal odor and the predator odor. So in the first experiment, the predator was a jaguar, and the non-predator was a tapir. And then there was these other 2 conditions. In the second experiment, the predator odor was a margay, which is a little felid that's quite lethal to these monkeys, and an agouti. And the third experiment, there was a jaguarundi, another felid, and a paca. So here were these aren't carnivores, these are herbivores, and then here are these 3 carnivores. So we would strap the dowel on and then record the monkey's behavior. And one of the variables was the average duration of visits. So what we wanted to know was, when it jumped onto the branch that had a dowel, how long did it stay? With the prediction that if you're smelling something that makes you nervous, you're probably not going to hang out there for very long. And in fact, that's what happened in all 3 experiments, that the predator, when there was a predator odor, they spent less time per visit on the dowel. Now, they made lots of visits. In fact, they kept going back and sniffing, but then they jump off right away because they were clearly nervous about it. This was the percent of visits that included sniffing, like this guy's doing. And again, when there was a predator odor, much more sniffing accompanied their visit to the dowel. So they were really sniffing those odors a lot. And then finally, the percent of time on the branch spent sniffing, so not just the number of sniffs, but how much time when they were there did they sniff. much higher in the predator conditions. So what they would do was jump over there, sniff, 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 jump off, look around, jump over there, sniff, 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 look around, as if trying to find the source of that odor. And in one remarkable trial, one of the monkeys, remember, all born in captivity, never seen any of these things, or smelled them, presumably. She jumped on the dowel for the first time, smelled the margay, and she gave an alarm call. Just blew me away. Okay, so clearly monkeys have a reaction to at least some odors. So why not snake odors? Well, another student of mine tried the experiment with some snake odors and did not get a response. Now, this wasn't with these particular monkeys. This was back to the Joffrey's marmosets at the safari park. But they didn't show any particular reaction to the snake odors that we gave them. Some other species, ground squirrels use odor to discriminate between rattlesnakes and harmless snakes. Rattlesnakes, their favorite meal is ground squirrels, and California ground squirrels have all kinds of amazing adaptations to avoid snakes. So they can tell the difference in their odors. There's some studies of lab mice and wild rodents that live in South America that do not recognize odors of fertile ants snakes, and those are powerful, deadly snakes. And like I said, we were unable to demonstrate snake odor discrimination in red-bellied tamarins or Joffrey's marmosets. So the odors seem to be, at least for primates, may not be a really salient way to avoid them. So that leaves vision. And as you know, primates are very visually advanced. Our visual systems are really quite incredible. For most primates, it's kind of the predominant sense. So Lynn Isbell from UC Davis wrote a book. She first wrote professional papers, and then wrote a book called The Fruit, the Tree, and the Serpent, where she argues that the primate visual system evolved the major characteristics it has because of snakes. Okay? Her theory, it's called snake detection theory, is that many of the features of our visual system are a direct consequence of this 80 million year old or whatever, 50 million year old interaction between primates and snakes. And you probably have just read this quote that was in the book where she says, "Several times in the course of field work, I froze just a step away from a puff adder or cobra. This may be due less to blind luck than 60 million years of directional selection operating on the K pathway for pre-attentive detection and the P pathway for perception and identification." So those two pathways are two visual pathways we have. And she makes a case. It's a really fun book if you want to read it. So the question is then, are we really very good at detecting snakes? Now, it turns out there's been quite a few studies of this, mostly not coming from snake detection theory per se, but it's mostly psychologists who are interested in how good we are at detecting threat of any sort. But snakes are often used in these studies to ask the question about detecting threat, because snakes are a threat. Many of the studies are done in what's called this computer-based visual search paradigm, where there's a computer screen and images, and the images would include threats like spiders and snakes, and then non-threatening things like flowers and mushrooms, and various other targets. And the subject is asked to find the thing that's different than all of the others. Now, this has been done with adult humans, with kids, and with monkeys, sitting in front of a touch screen in the case of the monkeys or the little kid. You train the monkeys to look for the odd object. And what's found in these studies almost always is that both snakes and spiders are found more quickly among flowers, frogs, and caterpillars than flowers, frogs, or caterpillars are found among snakes. So in other words, when you're looking for something different, the snake or the spider pops out of you more quickly. Lots of studies have demonstrated that with particular different species and different varieties of stimuli and that kind of thing. So yeah, it does seem like in these conditions, primates are good at detecting snakes. There are eye tracking studies that have been done investigating the same question. So in eye tracking studies, you wear something or you have your chin in a rest, and there's something that is able to determine where your eyes are looking straight ahead of you. And when they give, if you look on this side, this is just the same thing but black and white and you really can't see it. So if there's a threat, in this study they used lions, and they also used snakes in a different experiment, but they only had a picture of the lion, so that's why I put it up here. And the same idea, you're to detect the thing that is different in the array. So they would be asked to look for an impala, an antelope, among lions, or look for a lion among impalas. And what they find, as I've said here, in a process known as delayed disengagement, that they were slower to find the impala because they were spending so much time looking at the threat, and they were looking at more of the threat objects. Now, people weren't necessarily even aware that they were doing this, but we could tell from eye tracking where their eyes were going. And it made it more difficult to find the non-threatening target because they were spending so much time. So that shows us that these are really powerful, these threats are really powerful in drawing our attention to them. Oops, okay. So in a lot of the studies that I've just told you about, they have both spiders and snakes in the threat array. Because remember, like I told you, most of these studies are not testing snake detection theory, but just threat detection. So a good question is, all right, if snakes are really unique to us, uniquely detectable to us, then we should be able to detect snakes better than we even detect spiders, which are also a threat. But according to snake detection theory, snakes are really special. So the researchers in this, the Suarez lab did a really good study a couple years ago where they were really testing this exact question, snakes or spiders, which one is more salient to us? And they used what's called challenging attentional conditions. So the idea here is that if your brain is really engaged in having to do some task, you're really paying a lot of attention to it. If snakes are more important than spiders, then snakes should in some way interrupt or draw our attention to them more than spiders when we're really challenged. Otherwise, when we're really a lot of our cognitive energy is going to some other task. So what they found, for example, is that snakes are more often detected than spiders at the shortest durations of stimulus presentations. So when you're having to look at an array and say, is something there? And you're really concentrating because it's not going to be there very long, you find snakes more easily than spiders. They found that you found snakes no matter where they were in an array, even if they were way over here on the periphery, which we tend to look kind of in the center of a scene, and our peripheral vision isn't as good. But we detected snakes just as well on the periphery as in the center, which was not true of the spiders. Okay. Then this other really kind of interesting study, what they asked, so people were looking at a computer screen and they were asked to look in the middle and to push a yes or no on with their finger if they saw either an N, the letter N, or the letter Z. And then they'd flash a letter up here and you'd say yes or no, it was an N or a Z. On about 20% of those trials, they would flash for just a couple milliseconds, which is, you aren't consciously aware you've seen anything at that point, but you have seen it. So they would flash either a snake or a spider in one of the corners. Okay? Now, if one of those peripherally flashed stimuli is going to be, is really important, then it will cause you to be slower in determining whether or not you saw the correct letter. Spiders and snakes were equally, caused an equal amount of problem in detecting N or a Z when you just had one letter there. So when it was just one letter where you had to say N or Z, even if you saw a snake or spider subliminally, either it didn't interfere at all with your ability to detect it or it interfered similarly. But when you had to know if that letter was there amongst a bunch of letters, so it's harder because you're having to look at all the letters and see is there an N or an X there. Then the snake reduced reaction times, but the spider didn't. Okay, so even though you were really concentrating on the letters, the fact that you'd seen subliminally, didn't even know you'd seen it, meant you drew your attention for just a tiny fraction of a second, but it decreased your reaction time. Okay? So these studies suggested that, yes, snakes are special. They are especially good at getting our attention. Now, how does that work in our brains? This is really cool, I think. If you look over here, what you see is, if you look at these arrows that go here from the eyes, so here's the two eyeballs, and information coming from both eyes, and the information stops in a place in the brain called the thalamus. You guys have probably heard about this at some point along in your classes. This is the thalamus, and there's a particular spot in the thalamus called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and so there's a stop made here, there's one on either side, and then from there the information goes to your occipital lobe, to your primary visual cortex. And the primary visual cortex is where we see. Without the visual cortex, we don't see anything. You would say you were blind, okay? There's another pathway, though, that comes from the eye, but involves another place in the thalamus called the pulvinar, and a place in the midbrain called the superior colliculus. These two places are not part of that primary visual pathway, and this pathway never goes back here to the seeing part of your brain. So normally when you see anything, both of those pathways are activated, but only one of them is responsible for what you would call sight. This other pathway is responsible for detecting things in our environment very rapidly before maybe even your brain gets a chance to recognize what that is, and then giving us a chance to avoid or do whatever is appropriate with what we've just seen. So this over here, you see what they call the high and low pathways to fear. Here's this what they call low-level pathway. That's what I just described with the pulvinar and superior colliculus, which is not part of the cortex, and this high road, which is part of the cortex. Normally, they're working together. The low road includes a quick connection with the part of the brain called the amygdala, which many people call the fear center. It's a part of our brain that's responsible for interpretation of emotions, especially fearful emotions. So we have this subliminal pathway that helps us to identify threat because it makes us afraid. And then actually sort of what happens is that it pulls our eyeballs in the direction of that threatening stimulus, and it moves us away from it. It's really very cool. So studies have been done investigating, so this is the thalamus again, and investigating that pulvinar, that part of that's the part of the, go back up, right? It's right here. It's part of that subliminal, subcortical neurological pathway in vision. So what they've done is, they used monkeys for this, and they put a little recording electrode down into the pulvinar of these monkeys. And then the monkeys were sitting in a chair, and they had this electrode in their brain, and they're trained to look at this computer screen, and they just look at it, and the recording electrode says whether or not the particular cell reacted to that stimulus. And they put the recording electrode in a whole bunch of different neurons, cells in the pulvinar. And what they found is that when what was on the screen was either a snake of some sort, a face of a monkey, the hand of a monkey, or these just random shapes. Okay, so the monkey's sitting there, the recording electrode flashing on the screen is one of these things. What they found was that over 40%, or about 40%, of the neurons that they tested reacted to snakes and only to snakes. So you have, presumably this translates to humans, most likely it does, you have cells in your pulvinar that only burst off when you see a snake, okay? Those cells were much more common than cells that specialized in detecting monkey faces or monkey hands or other shapes. But pulvinar was reacting, various cells in the pulvinar were reacting to all these things, but the greatest number of them were reacting to snakes. And in fact, they reacted most strongly, if you measure the strength of the reaction, to rearing snakes. I don't know if you can tell, but that's what that is. That's a rearing snake versus a slithering snake. And rearing snakes are more threatening. Okay? So you have then specialized cells in your brain that are reacting to snakes, especially if snakes are in that posture that's most threatening to you. Pretty awesome. All right, so lots of evidence is that, yes, our brains are really good at detecting snakes, but there have been a couple of studies that challenged it a little bit. One study by Fox looked at, in that visual array, that computer, back to the computer, touch screen, looked at guns, a modern threat, and snakes, and found similar ease of detection of guns as of snakes. Okay. Another study that, go to this one, was actually done at Cal State San Marcos by my colleague Dustin Calvillo and his graduate student Whitney Hawkins. They were interested in what's called inattentional blindness, which is that if you guys ever seen that video where people are bouncing a basketball and you're supposed to count how often the basketball is passed? A guy in a gorilla suit walks by, and most people don't notice the guy in the gorilla suit. Once you're shown that and you see the video again, you can't believe you didn't see it. But because you were counting the basketball, you didn't even notice a guy in a gorilla suit walk by. It's called inattentional blindness, because when we're focusing on one thing really hard, we often just don't process something else that's going on. So they did an inattentional blindness study, thinking that the threatening stimuli would be detected more often, would break that inattentional blindness bias, but it didn't. They were no more likely to actually see, to notice the spider or the snake than they were to these other stimuli. So that was a little peculiar. So snakes attract our attention, but some of the computer-based tasks have generated unexpected or perplexing results. And in my lab, we began to talk about why would that be? Why are there some inconsistent results? And we thought, well, maybe it's because of the stimulus itself used in a particular study. A little line drawing of a snake may not be a powerful evocation of snakes in our brain, for example. Maybe the color is important, and there's all kinds of possibilities. And it would be hard to know what to make sure you include in a depiction of a snake for a study if you don't know what characteristics of the snake are most important to us. That is, what makes a snake to us. So a study done a few years ago addressed this when they asked if it was a coiled snake or a stretched out snake, would we detect this as easily as this? And the answer is no. We detect this much more easily than if this was stretched out. And in fact, anything vaguely snake-like that's coiled, like a hose, also gets our attention. So LeBeau and Deloche, who did this study, said it's that ability of snakes to get in that unique sinusoidal snake-like pattern or coil up that makes it a snake to us. That's what we're reacting to. That's what drags our attention to it. So we wanted to do this with, take that hypothesis and bring it into a more naturalistic setting. So these are two enclosures that had common marmosets in them. This is another research facility we used for a while up in Valley Center. And so there were two enclosures outdoors, and they look like this, so very naturalistic. And what we were, well, I'll show you the sort of tell you the background of it. So first of all, this is a common marmoset. And so here's a schematic of the 2 cages we had. And these were places in the cages that we'd identified as a place where we could put these little holders that we made out of clay that would hold, it's actually Cocoa Puffs. Marmosets really like Cocoa Puffs. I'm not particularly good for them, but it's anything for science, right? So what we would do is on any given day, we would take a bunch of either this kind, or this kind, or this kind, load them up with Cocoa Puffs, like you see here, and place them in some random number of about 5 of these locations. So we would put the monkeys in the back where they couldn't see, set this out. Again, it was either a snake-shaped day, a line, or a rectilineal-shaped day. And our hypothesis was that marmosets should be able to find more of the food and find it faster on days when the bait was in the serpentine-shaped receptacles. If that shape draws their attention, right, then they should see that and end up eating more of the food. But that didn't happen. Here's 7 of the monkeys and the number of pieces of cereal they found over a number of different trials. And as you can see, there was really no relationship between how much food they found and the shape that the food was in. Okay? So, all right, what might that have been about, we asked ourselves. And as we talk this through, and this is one of the great things about science, right? So you do this experiment and your hypothesis is not supported, so you sit down and think, hey, what was going on? Why were we wrong about that? And then you do an experiment that you try and control for whatever you think was wrong or do something different. And what we realized that there's many, many, many serpentine-shaped things in these monkeys' environment, in anybody's environment really, if you live in any forested place. There's vines, tree limbs, worms, I mean, lots of things are serpentine-shaped. And if monkeys, or primates in general, were spending all their time orienting toward every serpentine-shaped thing, they really would be at risk because they wouldn't be paying attention to the right kind of serpentine shape. And there's something that we call pre-attentive attention, which you saw in that subcortical pathway, where we might see something and then immediately decide it's not worth it and move on without even recognizing that we've even noticed that thing. So that got us interested then in the fact that there's really 3 steps to staying safe from snakes. First, you have to notice that it's there. That's detection. But that detection could happen very, very, very rapidly. So as soon as you detect it, then you have to bring your cortex into play and say, what do I do about it? And that usually requires some sustained attention. So you're walking along, your attention is your pre-attentive attention is drawn to something. You kind of look over there, and now you decide, oh, it's just a branch, or that's a snake, right? And you're going to really react to that. So there's detection, attention, and reaction. And so we wanted to know what features of snakes elicit attention, not just detection, but attention. We know that posture does matter in eliciting attention. We saw that in the study of the pulmonar, where monkeys had a greater reaction looking at the snake pictures, the rearing snake pictures than the slithering snake pictures. And there have been some other studies too showing that that animals will detect a rearing snake more than other things. Motion, you might say, what about movement? Absolutely, but let me remind you of a couple of things about movement. One is that snakes aren't always moving. In fact, they spend a lot of time not moving. So when they move, yes, it's probably a really important cue to detecting them, but they have to move first, and they don't. And this is just an interesting thing experimentally, it's really, really, really difficult to model snake motion. And you can't control a real snake's motion. So even the best, like robotics engineers at Carnegie Mellon University, which has the best robotics department in the country, they've had a terrible time making a robot that moves really like a snake. It's such a unique set of muscles and anatomy that It's just really hard to do that. So it's hard to study snake motion if you can't make models of that, because you can't teach a snake to move in only a certain way at only a certain time. So, okay, movement. But we got interested in snake skin. And the reason we got interested in it was because this is a pair of shoes one of my students, Megan Rice, wore sometimes when she was out with the monkeys. And every time she did, the monkeys would stare at her shoes and sometimes alarm call. And we sort of had thought long before that it looks kind of like snake skin, right? So we thought, let's really investigate this and see about snake patterns. And if there's something about snake pattern that really helps us identify them as snakes. There was one study in the literature, just one, where they put photographs. These were actual photographs. Oops. What happened there? Where these were actual photographs of snakes that they placed on the ground in front of wild monkeys, and they found that they attended more to the pattern snakes than the others. But there were a lot of problems with that study. Didn't have many controls or anything like that. So the other thing is that snake patterns come in a dizzying array of possibilities. I mean, name pretty much any color, any type of pattern, you'll see it, including some snakes that have no pattern at all. But one pattern that all snakes have is scales. All reptiles have scales, including things like lizards, but only snakes among reptiles can coil or get into that serpentine shape. So if you see something with the serpentine shape and scales, it's a snake. So we wondered if that really is what really will draw our attention to snakes, is that combination. Now, my student Jesse Wombolt did a terrific thesis where, this is again with those marmosets up at, common marmosets up in Valley Center. And she made stimuli that were in serpentine shape. This is made out of clay, again. So these. And one was plain, had no pattern. One had horizontal stripes, one vertical stripes, and one had scales. And then we had control of a triangle, not a serpentine shape, plain, and one with scales on it. And here's what we did. So here's that cage you saw before. And above the cage, and you can see it here, so this thing right here sits on top of the cage. We call it the penthouse. So it's just a little extension of their cages to give them more places to explore and be. There's a little trap door. So the monkeys like to be being up here, and we would lure one of them up into the penthouse and then close it in. Right here, this was outside the cage, was our blind, and it was covered on all sides except the top, so that when a monkey was in the penthouse and looking down, so here's the monkey in the penthouse, this is the main part of the cage. The monkey's looking down into that blind, and in the blind was one of the stimuli that I just showed you, okay? So we knew when the monkey was looking at it, because it's the only thing to look at right there, you could tell. And we recorded how long it spent looking at the stimulus, whether or not it gave alarm calls, and a bunch of other variables that I won't be talking about. So as a simple procedure, we put the monkey up there. As soon as it made its first look into the blind, we did 60 seconds of baseline recording to see how much time it spent looking when there was nothing there. Or there was something there, but it was covered. Then we removed the cover from the stimulus, and that was a manipulation for 60 seconds. And then we covered it up again and recorded for another 60 seconds. So we scored looking into the blind, alarm calls, and each monkey only saw each stimulus once so that it wouldn't get habituated to it. So here's what we found. There were 3 important conclusions from this. Serpentine shapes were more likely to elicit visual inspection if they were patterned. So here's the data from, this is the amount of attention you spend, how much time you look at it. Here was a snake that was unpatterned, snake in vertical lines, snake in horizontal lines, snake in scales. So if it had a pattern on it, they looked more than they did if it had no pattern. Alarm calls were most likely given if the stimulus was both serpentine and pattern. Okay? So here was the triangle, but they never made an alarm call to. triangle with scales, which a couple times they did. The plain snake, not much alarm calling. The snake with vertical, not too much more, but still you can see this trend toward alarm calls happening more with, this should say horizontal, the snake with scales. And the third conclusion, a scale pattern, even on a non-serpentine shape, elicited visual attention, but only in conjunction with the serpentine shape did it cause enough concern to produce an alarm call. So this is looking, and you see the triangle, and the triangle with scales got a lot of looking, more so than the plain snake. Okay, and here's the calling data. Look at how much the snake with scales got. So we did a follow-up study with more kinds of controls because we realized that the snake scale pattern was more complex than either the other patterns. So we wanted a non-scaled but complex pattern. So we did little asterisks on this one. There were some other changes to the study, not too many. Did it again. And the conclusions there were similar, that serpentine shape matters, more inspection of serpentine shape, that pattern matters, and that serpentine shape, along with some complex pattern, gets the most attention. But it didn't seem to be just scales, because the scales and the star shape control got similar amounts of attention. So again, serpentine shape, yes, important. Pattern, yes, important, but probably no particular pattern as long as it's complex. Okay, so I'm coming to the last study that we have done. So you can be thinking about questions you want to ask me after that. And I'm showing you these pictures because, again, as my students and I are talking about the work we've been doing and what we were finding, we realized that a lot of the studies of looking at snake detection or snake attention happen, especially snake detection, happen under very artificial conditions because we're trying to control things to do this experiment. And that most of the time, the time when people need most to detect snakes is when they're doing something else. Because animals, and including humans, don't go out looking for snakes usually. They go out to do other things. To find food, they're making fire to cook food. This marmoset is obviously just found a grasshopper. I really like that. This one's looking for food. I mean, you might be interacting with your group mates. You're doing other things. So our system needs to be set up so that we detect snakes when we're doing something else. It's one thing to say, there's a snake out there, can you find it? There's another thing to ask, if you don't know whether or not there's a snake there, can you find it? And can you find it when you're doing something else? Because that's the time we're most at risk, right? When our attention is to something else and we're not looking for the snake that might be there. So we did a study on campus at Cal State San Marcos. This is the Social and Behavioral Sciences building where we have our offices. And this is a walking path that's on the back side of it, on the east side of it. It's not very well used. This is a service road, also not used that often. So this is a perfect place for us because there's not many people walking along here. And all along the side of the building, there are some trees and some shrubs and stuff like that. So we were able to take people out there and have them go on a walk, not telling them what this was all about. What we made was stimuli, kind of coming from the Jesse Wombolt's thesis inspiration. So we had serpentine shaped, and this one was scaled, and this one was plane. And then we also had this rectilineal shape, scaled and plane, and a triangle, scaled and plane. So the question was, would people going on a walk, not looking for anything in particular, see this, either of these, more often than these? And would they see this one more than this one because it had scales to it? So we put these stimuli out along that, to the right of or to the west of the pathway. So I'm walking along like this, and here's the building over here, and here's that area with had shrubs and trees, right? And we would just, and along there was one of these stimuli. On any given trial, there was just one stimulus. And we took people down there and we said, okay, just walk up to the place where you see that ribbon up there. And I think we said, just enjoy nature between here and the building. Just enjoy the nature. So, you know, undergrads that are doing these things for course credit, if you go to Cal State San Marcos and you take lower division classes, you'll have to do this. You have to get so many units being a participant. And so, you know, they're like, okay, whatever. And they go walking along and they're just, you know, looking like this. Some of them, despite the fact that you say, please look between here and the building, they're like this. You're gonna get eaten by a snake or fail or something. You can't follow instructions. Most of them did. They're just walking along, looking. And when they got back, we said, okay, did you see this? We had some, did you see this and this and this? And then we showed them a picture of the stimulus, did you see this? And in order to determine if they were being honest, if they said yes, we said, where was it? And they'd had to be able to say, oh yeah, I remember it was right over there. Okay, so that was it. We ran, I don't know, 150 participants. And here's kind of how, again, pictures of how it looked. You know, it's funny, because obviously we knew we were there, and when we first started, we thought, oh, everybody's going to see these things. Everybody is. It's amazing how often people didn't see anything, no matter what the condition. It's knowing to expect something really changes what you see. So here's a picture of me walking along there, pretending I'm a participant. Okay. And here's what we found. So the pink is no, I didn't see it when they got back, and the green is yes, I saw it. When it was a triangle, about 55% of the time they said I saw it. About the same for rectilineal, and 66% said they saw it in the serpentine. This is not a significant difference. It's a trend, but you probably know what that means. It means that this could have happened by chance. It's not a greater enough difference for us to say, wow, that was really an effect. And having scales or not also didn't play a role on what they saw. So there's this interesting kind of provocative trend, but not enough to feel confident. I don't have any pictures of this, but just last spring, we did another version of this, same story. They didn't detect the serpentine shape better. So our conclusion from that is that this is a complicated thing, that there have to be a whole bunch of conditions that are accurate or correct in some way for us to really bring our good snake detection capabilities to the front. And that might include a general sense of understanding that we might be at risk. So when you go on a hike, and if you know anything about going on hikes around here, and it's this summer, you probably are a little bit aware of the fact that there are rattlesnakes out there, right? And you're probably a little bit careful. I hope you are. So as you're walking along, you're not experiencing fear really, but you're kind of, you know, you're looking around, right? Don't you? Well, you should. You don't. So there might be kind of a low-level understanding that you're in a place where this might be an issue for you before the snake detection really kicks in, right? And that's a very hard thing to create in the lab, to control it. The role of movement, the role of how realistic a snake might look. For the monkeys, I showed you that freeze-dried rattlesnake, and that they reacted to every single time. They really believed that was a snake. We've had other models that look to us pretty realistic, that they like, nah, it's not real. You could tell they didn't react to it. Why not? We couldn't figure out how is this different than this? So primates are smart about it. They can't afford to overreact to things, but we have to react appropriately to things that are really a threat to us. So it provides us all kinds of interesting potential questions about what studies to do next. Future research, I don't know, we want to put people out on a real, we're going to have people take a virtual, well, some of you might, if you transfer to Cal State San Marcos, you can't be in this study because I'm telling you what's going on with it. We're going to have them take a virtual hike So we're gonna use a GoPro and have somebody do a hike and then have people go on the hike and try to get them to really believe that they're on a hike and see what they detect. And we're probably going to use GSR, galvanic skin response, to see if they show a physiological reaction even if they didn't see it. So we would know if that GSR spiked at the time that they walked by a snake that we would put on, not a real one, snake model we would put on the trail, et cetera. All kinds of possibilities to study avoidance, detection, attention, reaction to snakes. So thanks.